My name is Elizabeth Turner, and on the night my husband proposed to his mistress in front of our entire family, I raised my glass, smiled, and revealed the kind of secret that silenced the room. But before I tell you what I said before, you hear the gasp that froze every fork halfway to every mouth. You need to understand how we got there. Because betrayal like his doesn't just happen in one moment, it builds like a storm over years of marriage. When I married Charles, I thought I had the American dream. He was charming, ambitious, the kind of man who filled a room with his laugh. We met in college in the library of all places. He spilled coffee over my stack of books and insisted on replacing them, though I never let him. That accident turned into hours of talking, then dates, then the kind of whirlwind romance I thought only existed in movies. I believed in him. More than that, I built my life around him. When he got his first job at a small accounting firm, I was the one who ironed his shirts and packed his lunches, because we couldn't afford dry cleaning or takeout. When he wanted to take a risk and start his own practice, I supported him, even though it meant scraping by on my salary as a part-time teacher and watching every penny. And when he came home late, exhausted shoulders heavy with the weight of clients who expected more than any young man should carry, I rubbed his back and whispered, "We'll make it through. We always do." For years I thought that was what love was. Quiet sacrifice, shared dreams. I was the one behind the scenes, making the phone calls, handling the bills, smoothing things over with his mother when she worried he was taking on too much. And he was the face of success. Everyone saw him as the man who built his fortune, but I knew the truth. It was our fortune. Ours. Or so I thought. Looking back, I can see the cracks that had been there for years. The late nights at the office that grew longer and longer long after the practice was stable. The phone calls he took in the garage away from the kids and me. His voice pitched just a little too soft. The scent of perfume on his jackets that wasn't mine, always faint, always deniable. I asked once gently over dinner, "Charles, is there someone else?" He laughed loud and dismissive, like the very idea was ridiculous. "Elizabeth, you watch too many soap operas. You're the only woman for me." He reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and I wanted so badly to believe him that I did. But my gut knew better. It's funny how a woman's intuition works. You tuck away every small betrayal, every little sign, because admitting the truth feels like unraveling your entire life. And my life, my family, my reputation, the home we'd built, wasn't something I was willing to watch crumble. Not yet. So I stayed quiet, observant, patient. And then came the invitation. A big family dinner. Charles announced, his eyes sparkling with that familiar excitement he wore when closing a major deal. He said it was to celebrate a new chapter, and he insisted everyone come, siblings, cousins, even his mother, who had been too frail for big gatherings lately. I remember standing in front of the mirror before we left, smoothing down the silk dress I hadn't worn in years. It used to be my favorite, but that night it felt more like armor. I dabbed on lipstick, the deep red he once said he loved, though I noticed he hadn't complimented me in months. In the car, silence stretched between us. He hummed under his breath some cheerful tune while I stared out the window at the blur of streetlights. My hands were folded tightly in my lap, nails pressing crescents into my palms. Something was coming. I didn't know what, but my body felt it. When we arrived, the dining room was glowing with warm candlelight, long table gleaming with silverware polished within an inch of its life. Relatives greeted us with hugs, laughter, the clink of glasses. Charles was in his element, patting shoulders, telling jokes. His mistress, though I didn't know she was his mistress yet, hovering nearby with a practiced smile. She was introduced as a colleague, someone he'd been working with on a major case. She was younger than me by at least a decade, blonde, slim, her dress just a touch too tight for a family dinner. She shook my hand with eyes that didn't quite meet mine, and in that instant my gut screamed the truth. Still, I played my role, the dutiful wife. I smiled, I chatted, I poured wine for his mother and asked his cousin about her new job. But my mind was elsewhere, circling, bracing for a blow I couldn't yet name. And then it happened. Midway through the meal, with laughter bubbling around the table and plates half cleared, Charles stood. He clinked his glass with his fork, that wide grin plastered across his face. "Everyone," he said, voice booming with pride, "I have an announcement." And right there in front of me, his family and God himself, he dropped to one knee. Not in front of me, in front of her. The room fell silent. His mother gasped. His sister dropped her fork. I sat frozen, staring as the man I had loved for 15 years pulled out a velvet box and opened it to reveal a glittering diamond. "Marissa," he said, eyes shining, "will you marry me?" It was as if the air itself had been punched out of the room. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't collapse the way they expected. I smiled. And I raised my glass. Because I had been waiting for this moment. The room had gone so still I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. A clock that had belonged to Charles's father, a man who would have been mortified to see his son on bended knee before another woman, while his wife sat just 3 feet away. Marissa's hand flew to her mouth, trembling, her eyes darting toward me for a fraction of a second before settling back on Charles. She whispered, "Yes," though it came out so faint, almost strangled, that the word barely carried across the table. Charles beamed, sliding the ring onto her finger as if he were starring in a romantic film rather than destroying his family in front of a live audience. His face was radiant with triumph, chest puffed, chin high. He kissed her hand, and the sound of it, soft, smug, was louder to me than all the chatter that had vanished from the room. I could feel every set of eyes flicking between the three of us, him, her, me. His mother clutched her napkin so tightly her knuckles blanched white. His sister muttered, "Oh my God," under her breath. His cousin, never one for subtlety, dropped his wineglass with a shatter that seemed almost poetic. I didn't flinch, not once. Because here's the truth. The worst pain is never the sudden betrayal. It's the long erosion of trust that comes before it. This proposal wasn't a surprise, not really. It was confirmation of what my heart had known for years. And instead of breaking me, it steeled me. Charles, oblivious to the mortified stares of his family, rose to his feet, pulling Marissa up beside him. "I want everyone to welcome the woman who has made me the happiest man alive," he declared, puffing out his chest. Happiest man alive. The words rang in my ears, mockery of the nights I spent alone waiting for him, the sacrifices I had made to hold together a home, the dignity I had swallowed when whispers reached me that maybe my husband wasn't as faithful as he seemed. Marissa smiled shyly, holding out her hand so the diamond could catch the candlelight. It sparkled, casting fractured reflections across the tablecloth. For a fleeting second, I almost admired her nerve. To sit there in front of me, surrounded by his family, and accept his proposal with the kind of boldness that only youth and arrogance can summon. "Isn't she beautiful?" Charles crowed, slipping his arm around her waist. "I know this might come as a shock, but sometimes life takes us in unexpected directions. Marissa is my future." Unexpected directions. That was his phrase. As though our marriage, our children, our years of building something from nothing were just detours. Temporary inconveniences before he found what he thought he deserved. I felt the heat of every gaze, the pity that clung to me like a second skin. They were waiting for me to crumble, to scream, to slap him, to sob. They wanted drama, the kind that would become family lore whispered about at Christmases for decades to come. But instead I sat very still. I lifted my glass, my fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "Congratulations," I said smoothly, my voice carrying across the hushed room. Charles turned, his smile widening in surprise. He'd expected resistance, maybe fury, but not this. "Thank you, Elizabeth. I knew you'd understand. You've always been supportive." The audacity of that word nearly made me laugh aloud. supportive, as though I were applauding him for ripping apart our lives in front of his mother and children. But laughter would come later. For now, I gave him exactly what he wanted: composure. "Of course," I said, simply swirling the wine in my glass. My smile didn't falter. But inside, oh inside, I was already rewinding time, playing back every late night, every lie, every missing receipt. And I knew exactly where this was heading. Across the table, his mother found her voice. "Charles, what on earth are you doing?" she demanded, her frail voice trembling with both age and outrage. "Mother," he began, adopting that patronizing tone he used when convincing clients to sign on the dotted line. "I know this is difficult, but Elizabeth and I have grown apart. Marissa makes me happy. Don't I deserve happiness?" The mistress lowered her gaze, cheeks flushed, but the smug little smile never left her lips. I leaned back, listening, observing. Because this was his stage, and he was basking in his moment. What he didn't realize was that I had built an entirely different stage, and very soon he would find himself center spotlight in a play he didn't audition for. Dinner resumed, though no one ate. Forks scraped plates with half-hearted motions. Conversations faltered into awkward silences. Charles filled the void with stories about Marissa, how they met at the firm, how she'd challenged him, how she was different. Each word was a dagger, but I didn't let it pierce me. Not anymore. Instead, I cataloged every detail: the way his hand lingered too long on hers, the way she avoided my eyes, the way his family sat in stunned disapproval. By the time dessert arrived, my decision was sealed. This would be the last time he ever humiliated me. He thought this dinner marked a new beginning for him. He had no idea it was the beginning of his end. I lifted my glass again, smiling, and the room quieted. They thought perhaps I was going to toast to his happiness, bless his union play, The Dutiful Wife, until the ink dried on our divorce papers. But no. I was preparing to deliver something far more devastating. The clinking of silverware had all but died down. The only real sound was the occasional cough, or the squeak of a chair shifting uncomfortably. I sat in the middle of it all, sipping my wine as though nothing had happened, though I could feel the eyes of every single person at that table drilling into me. Charles leaned back in his chair, still grinning like a conquering hero, arms slung carelessly around Marissa's shoulders. She leaned toward him, trying to play the role of a bashful bride-to-be, though the corners of her mouth twitched with something closer to smugness than modesty. I let my gaze drift to the chandelier above us, the crystals catching the flicker of candlelight. Funny how something so fragile could refract so much brilliance. I wondered if anyone else noticed the faint tremor in my hand as I lowered my glass, or if they only saw what I wanted them to see: serenity. Elizabeth, Charles finally addressed me directly, as though remembering I was still at the table. "I know this is unusual, but I want you to understand, Marissa and I, what we have, is real." The silence that followed was deafening. Every cousin, every aunt, every brother and sister leaned forward slightly, waiting for me to crumble. Waiting for the grand explosion. I tilted my head, studied him for a moment, and then smiled. "Of course," I said softly. "If you believe it's real, then who am I to argue?" Marissa shifted uneasily, perhaps thrown off by my calmness. She looked down at her ring, twirling it on her finger, and for a split second her confidence faltered. Inside, I was seething. Not because he had found someone else; that wound had already been inflicted long before this dinner, but because he dared to humiliate me like this in front of his family, as if I were nothing more than a placeholder to be discarded. But rage, I knew, was useless. Rage burns fast and bright, leaving only ashes. No, what I needed was control. So I breathed deeply, letting my chest rise and fall with the steadiness of someone who still held all the cards. Across the table, his mother dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. She muttered something about shame, about disgrace, and Charles patted her hand condescendingly. His sister whispered to her husband, shaking her head in disbelief. Even the children, wide-eyed and confused, could sense the fracture in the air. I looked at them, our children, and felt the weight of it all pressing down. They deserved better than this circus. They deserved better than a father who thought parading his mistress at dinner was romance. So I straightened my shoulders, set my glass gently on the table, and spoke with deliberate calm. "You must be very happy," I said, turning toward Marissa. Her lips parted, uncertain whether to thank me or stay silent. She settled for a quick, awkward nod. "And Charles?" I continued, letting my voice carry just enough to reach every corner of the room. "You've always loved grand gestures. This one, I admit, tops them all." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the table, quickly dying when no one was sure if I was joking. Charles, oblivious, chuckled. "Well, you know me. Go big or go home." Go big or go home. The irony nearly choked me. I lifted my glass again, swirling the ruby liquid, the scent of oak and berries filling my nose. "Yes," I said, locking eyes with him, "home is a very important thing." He blinked, not catching the weight of my words. But one or two of the older relatives tilted their heads, sensing something brewing beneath the surface. That was the thing about silence, it unnerved people far more than shouting ever could. They wanted a spectacle. I gave them poise. And in that poise, I planted unease. Because beneath my smile, I was already miles ahead. I was thinking of the papers I had signed, the accounts I had closed, the home I had sold without his knowledge. Let him bask tonight. Let him grin and preen and believe he had won. Tomorrow he would wake up to a very different world. The dessert plates clattered onto the table, untouched by most. Charles launched into a story about how he and Marissa had met, how she had brought fresh energy into his life. I let the words wash over me, meaningless syllables from a man who had mistaken arrogance for charm. Every now and then I caught someone's eye across the table, a cousin, an aunt, even his sister. Their looks were filled with questions, sympathy, judgment. I answered them all with a single steady expression: "I am not broken." I took another sip of wine, savoring its dryness on my tongue, and thought, not yet anyway. But soon, very soon. I remember the first time I truly knew something was wrong, not guessed, not suspected, knew. It was a Tuesday night, late autumn, maybe 3 years ago. Charles had claimed he had a late client dinner, but when I walked past his office downtown, the windows were dark. No cars in the lot except mine. I sat there in the silence of my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles hurt. And for the first time, I asked myself the question out loud: what if he isn't where he says he is? That question changed everything. From that night on, I stopped being the trusting wife who took every excuse at face value. I became something else, an observer, a collector of details. I didn't accuse him. I didn't scream. Instead, I listened. I watched. I gathered. When he told me he had to work late, I noted the time he left and the time he came home. When receipts appeared for restaurants we had never been to together, I tucked them away in a folder. When I noticed the faint trace of perfume lingering on his collar, I didn't confront him. I wrote down the date and the hour. I became quiet, deliberate, invisible in my own home. And when the evidence was enough that even I couldn't deny it, I sought help. A lawyer. Not the divorce attorney you see on television commercials, but a sharp, meticulous woman recommended by a friend who had gone through something similar. Her name was Claire. Claire listened to me for over an hour as I poured out everything, every receipt, every suspicion, every lonely night. When I finished, she didn't pat my hand or murmur sympathy. She leaned back, folded her hands, and said, "Elizabeth, if you want to leave him, I can help you do it in a way that protects you. But if you want to stay, then we play the long game." The long game. That phrase sang in my ears. I didn't know then which I wanted more, freedom or revenge. But I knew one thing: I would never again let Charles have the upper hand. So I listened to Claire. She taught me how to quietly separate our finances, how to ensure that my name was tied to every asset that mattered. She showed me how to gather documents, how to prepare signatures, how to shield myself from debts he might try to saddle me with. And most importantly, she taught me patience. "Don't show your hand until you're ready," she said. "Men like your husband think they're invincible. They don't see the knife until it's already between their ribs." I followed her advice to the letter. The first major move was the house. Our house wasn't just a home, it was my prison. Every wall whispered the sacrifices I'd made, every corner carried echoes of arguments swallowed down. I loved it once, but by the time Charles began staying out past midnight, it had become a monument to disappointment. So I sold it. Not impulsively, not recklessly. I handled it quietly, legally, with every signature accounted for. By the time Charles realized the papers were signed, the money transferred. He thought it was still ours, that he still had somewhere to call home. He was wrong. Then came the accounts. Our joint checking our savings, even the brokerage account he bragged about at family gatherings. Slowly, methodically, I drained them. Not in a way that set off alarms, just enough, week by week, transfer by transfer, until finally the balances sat at zero. He never noticed. Or if he did, he chalked it up to expenses or investments. His arrogance blinded him. Meanwhile, I built my safety net. Opened accounts in my name alone, tucked money into certificates of deposit, even bought a small property under a trust he didn't know existed. For the first time in years, I was secure. Not because of him, but in spite of him. And then I waited. Waiting wasn't easy. Every night he didn't come home, every time he whispered into his phone in the garage, I had to swallow the urge to confront him. But I reminded myself patience is a weapon, and mine was sharpened to a razor's edge. The irony was that Charles believed he was in control the entire time. He strutted through the house like a man with secrets, certain that I was too naive, too loyal to ever suspect. He looked at me and saw a woman he could discard when it suited him. What he didn't see was the steel beneath my silence. So when he invited me to that family dinner, when he insisted that everyone be there, I knew the time had come. I didn't know the exact stage he'd set for himself, but I knew it would be grand. Charles didn't do anything small. And I was ready. As I sat at that table watching him slide the ring onto Marissa's finger, my pulse didn't race with panic. It thrummed with anticipation. Because the game I had been playing in shadows for years was about to end. Not with tears, not with begging, but with a toast that would strip him of everything he thought he owned. And in that moment, sipping my wine and smiling at the room full of stunned faces, I realized something. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the executioner. The candles had burned lower, their wax dripping in uneven rivers down the tall holders. The dining room smelled of roasted meat gone cold and wine left to sour in half-emptied glasses. Yet no one moved to clear the plates. Every person at that table seemed paralyzed, caught between horror and fascination. Charles stood tall, his hand proudly gripping Marissa's, her ring flashing beneath the chandelier as though mocking me with every glint. He looked around, basking in his own spotlight, savoring the silence that followed his announcement like it was applause. I let him have it. I sat straight in my chair, my fingers brushing the stem of my wine glass. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It beat steady, deliberate, as though it knew what was coming. I had imagined this moment countless times in the privacy of my mind, but now that it was here, reality felt sharper, heavier. Charles cleared his throat. "I know this is a shock," he began, his voice carrying over the clatter of someone nervously setting down a fork. "But life is short. We deserve happiness, and Marissa makes me the happiest man alive." He was still talking when I raised my glass. The crystal caught the light, and for a moment the room's attention shifted from him to me. The chatter died entirely. Even the children stopped whispering. They all knew instinctively that I was about to speak, and no one dared interrupt. I smiled. Not a polite, forced smile, but one of genuine calm. the kind that unnerves people because they expect tears, not poise. "I'd like to make a toast," I said, my voice clear, steady. Charles blinked at me, confused but amused. He gestured grandly as though inviting me to endorse his betrayal. "Of course, Elizabeth. The floor is yours." I stood slowly, the legs of my chair scraping against the hardwood. Every eye followed me as I lifted my glass higher. My gaze swept the table, meeting the faces of his mother, his sister, his cousins, each one tight with tension, waiting for the explosion. To Charles and Marissa, I began my words, smooth, deliberate. "May your future be everything you dreamed of." Charles grinned, relief flickering across his face. Marissa exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly. They thought I was giving them my blessing. I let the silence stretch, savoring their moment of false comfort. And then softly but with razor edges I added, "And may that future be warm and comfortable in the house I just sold, with the money I already emptied from our accounts." The words hit the table like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted. Someone dropped a spoon with a sharp clang. Charles froze, his smile, faltering, his hand still clutching Marissa's, as though she were the only thing tethering him to the earth. "What?" he whispered. I lowered my glass, tilting my head. "You heard me, darling. The house is gone. Sold. The accounts emptied. Every last cent you thought was waiting for you, and your new bride is no longer yours to spend." His face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed like a man searching for air. That's impossible." "Nothing is impossible with the right lawyer," I said evenly. The room erupted into a cacophony, chairs scraping, relatives murmuring, his mother clutching her chest in shock. Marissa's hand slipped from his, her ring glittering mockingly as she stared at me in horror. You can't do this," Charles stammered, his voice rising, desperate. "This is our life. Our money." "Our money," I cut in sharply, my voice slicing through his denial. "No, Charles. You forfeited that when you chose to humiliate me. I simply ensured I wouldn't be left with nothing." The weight of the truth pressed on everyone in that room. The calm way I spoke made it all the more devastating. There were no hysterics, no shouted accusations, only cold, measured fact. Charles lunged forward as though to grab me, but his sister stood quickly, intercepting him with a glare sharp enough to stop him mid-step. "Don't you dare!" she hissed. He stumbled back, breathing hard, sweat beading at his temples. Marissa withdrew her hand completely, slipping her fingers into her lap as though she could hide the ring. I lifted my glass one final time. "So yes, here's to your future. May you build it from the ground up. You'll have to, because I've already taken down the foundation." And with that, I drank. Slowly, deliberately letting the wine burn its way down, savoring the silence that followed. Around me, relatives whispered, exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some looked at me with admiration, others with fear. But none of them would forget what they had just witnessed. Charles collapsed back into his chair, pale and trembling. Marissa shifted away from him ever so slightly, as though distance might shield her from his downfall. The toast was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The silence that followed my toast was more violent than any outburst could have been. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on your chest, heavy and suffocating, daring anyone to break it. Charles sat slumped in his chair, his mouth hanging open, eyes darting around the table as if someone else might leap to his defense. No one did. His mother stared at him, lips trembling, her face ashen beneath the soft glow of the chandelier. His sister's eyes burned with a mixture of disgust and vindication. Even his cousins, who had always laughed at his jokes, refused to meet his gaze. It was Marissa who finally shattered the silence. "What do you mean? You sold the house?" Her voice trembled, pitched higher than before, panic bleeding into each syllable. She looked from me to Charles as though expecting him to explain it away, to dismiss me with one of his booming laughs. But Charles wasn't laughing. He rubbed his temples, sweat beading along his brow, muttering, "This can't be happening. She's bluffing. She has to be bluffing. I set my empty wine glass gently on the table. Do I look like a woman who bluffs, Charles? He glared at me, the anger finally surfacing his face blotchy and red. You conniving? Careful, I interrupted, my tone low sharp. Choose your next words wisely, you're still in front of your family. A hush fell again. His sister leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Elizabeth, is it true? Did you really sell the house? Yes, I said simply. Legally, properly, all above board. And as of last month, the money from the sale has been placed where only I can access it. Gasps rippled around the table. Marissa's eyes widened, her manicured fingers clutching at her new engagement ring as if it could anchor her. You can't do that. That was supposed to be our house. I smiled, tilting my head. Our house. My dear, you've known him for what, a year? That house was built on 20 years of my sacrifices. You don't get to lay claim to it. Charles slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the silverware. You ruined me, he shouted. Everything I've worked for. Everything we worked for, I corrected coolly. Don't rewrite history just because you're embarrassed. You may have been the face of success, but I was the foundation. And unlike you, I made sure my foundation was unshakable. He sputtered, his rage deflating into desperation. Elizabeth, listen. We can fix this. We don't have to end like this. The audacity nearly made me laugh. End like this? I leaned forward, my voice cutting like glass. Charles, you ended us the moment you got down on one knee in front of her. Don't talk to me about fixing what you shattered. Across the table, Marissa's face had gone pale. She pulled her hand away from Charles's grasp, folding her arms across her chest. For the first time that evening, I saw fear in her eyes, not of me, but of the future she thought she was inheriting. What about the accounts? One cousin asked tentatively. Did you really? Yes, I confirmed. Every joint account is closed. Every dollar is gone. And before anyone worries, no, I didn't steal it. I claimed what was rightfully mine. I ensured that my children would never suffer because of their father's foolishness. His mother let out a sob, covering her face with her hands. How could you do this, Charles? To your wife? To your family? Charles's shoulders sagged under her disappointment. For the first time in his life, he looked small, diminished. The dinner was over. Not officially, no one announced it, but the air had curdled beyond saving. Plates were abandoned, chairs pushed back. Relatives murmured excuses and slipped away one by one, casting me looks of solidarity, of awe, of quiet approval. When the last of them had gone, only a few of us remained, Charles pale and silent, Marissa furious and humiliated, his sister who lingered out of loyalty to me more than to him. I stood smoothing my dress, my composure unshaken. I'll be leaving now, I said calmly. Charles, I suggest you find somewhere else to stay tonight. The house you think is yours no longer exists. He shot to his feet, his voice breaking. Elizabeth, please, you can't just walk away. You can't leave me with nothing. I looked at him, really looked at him. The man who once charmed me, who once whispered promises of forever, now reduced to a desperate shadow of himself. I didn't leave you with nothing, I said softly. You did that all on your own. And then I turned, walking past him, past Marissa, past the remnants of a dinner that would be remembered not for his proposal, but for my revelation. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. I inhaled deeply, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight of his lies. I wasn't bound to his betrayals. I was free. The night after the dinner, I slept for the first time in months. Not the restless, half-waking doze of someone waiting for footsteps on the stairs or for a garage door to grind open at 2 a.m., but a deep, anchoring sleep that felt like sinking into safe harbor. When I woke, the world was crisp and quiet. Sunlight pushed through the blinds in clean stripes, and dust drifted like tiny comets in the beam. I made coffee the way I used to before I learned his preferences, and forgot my own strong, dark, a splash of cream, no sugar, and stood barefoot at the window of my new apartment watching the city breathe. The phone lit with messages I didn't open, missed calls from Charles, 2 terse texts from an unknown number that could only be Marissa, a flurry of voicemails from relatives still reeling. I scrolled past them to the single message I knew I could bear, one from Claire. "You did the hard thing with Grace," she'd written. "Now do the next thing. Live." I smiled. The word felt as large and simple as the morning. I showered dressed in jeans and a soft sweater and gathered the pieces of a life that now fit neatly into the things I had chosen to keep: a framed photo of the kids at the beach, sand clumped on their ankles, the old cookbook with my mother's notes curling in the margins, my father's fountain pen that writes like it remembers me. I placed them around the apartment until the rooms stopped echoing and began to hold me. Around noon, I met Claire at a small cafe that smelled of cinnamon and clean beginnings. She arrived in her usual brisk step and practical boots, a woman who never apologized for taking up space. We ordered scones and coffee, and when I sat, she studied my face for a long moment before nodding, satisfied. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Lighter," I said, "and a little empty." "That's normal. You've been carrying a house on your back. Set it down and your body wonders where the weight went." I laughed, small but real. "Marissa texted," I added, and Claire's eyebrow lifted. "Let me guess, outrage dressed up as innocence." "Something like that. She says she didn't know. That Charles told her our marriage was over, that I was cold, that I didn't support him." Claire stirred her coffee. "Maybe she didn't know. Maybe she chose not to know. Either way, not your burden." I let that settle. Outside, an elderly couple crossed the street holding hands, their pace steady, measured. For a moment, an old ache brushed my ribs. I had once imagined an old age like that. Not rich, not grand, just together. "I keep thinking about the kids," I said quietly. "How to explain without poisoning them?" "Truth without venom," Claire replied. "Children can hold complicated stories if you hand them gently." She paused, then added, "And boundaries, especially with Charles." Boundaries. The word felt like a warm wall at my back. That afternoon, I drove to the park where I used to take the kids when they were small, where the swing chains are worn smooth from 1,000 tight little fists. I sat on a bench under the sycamore and called them. I told them the truth in careful measures, the way you pour hot tea slowly so nothing spills and scalds. I said their father had made choices that hurt our family. I said grown-ups sometimes break promises, and when they do, we don't break too. We rebuild. Their questions were clean and direct. I answered what I could and left what I couldn't for later. When we hung up, they each said in their different ways, "We love you." It landed like a blessing. That evening, I let myself feel the grief, really feel it. Not the adrenaline-laced fury that had fueled me, but the soft, stubborn sadness for the life I wanted and didn't get. I cried for the early years when we were poor and happy and believed hard work could outrun character. I cried for the woman who mistook endurance for devotion, who called silence dignity when it was fear. And then, when the tears were done, I washed my face, turned on the lamp with the warm shade, and opened a notebook to a blank page. On the first line, I wrote in my father's pen, "What do you want, Elizabeth?" The question startled me with its audacity. Desire had been something to translate into someone else's comfort for so long that I barely recognized my own voice. Still it answered. In spidery ink, I wrote a kitchen that smells like garlic and laughter, friends who show up unasked with extra chairs, a job that uses my patience and my spine, a front door I lock at night without dread, a life that is mine. The days that followed were ordinary in the way miracles always are. I met with a headhunter and admitted that the skills I called homemaking were logistics, budgeting, conflict resolution, project management with stakes. I started consulting for a small nonprofit that needed someone who could coax order from chaos. I relearned my neighborhood on foot, the florist who tucks a sprig of rosemary into your bouquet for luck, the barber who remembers every name, the librarian who presses a novel into your hand with the promise this one knows you. I also saw Charles, once, in a fluorescent office where even the plants looked tired. His lawyer spoke more than he did. The rage I expected wasn't there. Instead, there was a kind of limp defiance, a boy with a broken kite insisting the wind was wrong. I answered what the process required and nothing more. When he tried to reach for my eyes with old phrases, "We were good once," you know me, I felt only a distant tenderness for the memory, not the man. When I left, the air outside tasted like rain, metallic and clean. One evening, his mother called. Her voice was smaller than I remembered, paper thin with confusion and apology. "I didn't raise him for this," she whispered. "I know," I said. "But you raised me for this kindness and a spine." She laughed through tears. We promised to keep seeing each other not as instruments in his story, but as women in our own. And on a quiet Sunday, I walked back through our old block to say goodbye to the house. The for sale sign was gone. In its place stood a family on the porch, tired parents with paint on their sleeves, a little girl holding a goldfish in a bag like a lantern, a teenager pretending not to care and failing. The mother caught my eye and smiled, the smile of a woman trying to make a home out of boxes and hope. I lifted my hand in blessing and kept walking. The tug in my chest eased. The house was no longer a museum of my disappointments. It was a beginning for someone else. That felt right. If you're listening to this, maybe you're standing at your own window counting the thin hours. Maybe you're swallowing words that scorch your tongue. Maybe you've been told that good women endure, that marriage is a shrine where you kneel even when your knees bleed. I am not here to tell you to torch your life. I am here to tell you to name it, to gather your papers, to get a Claire, to remember the body you live in and the future that still wants you. Patience is a tool, not a sentence. Silence can be strategy, but it should never be a cage. People will call what I did revenge. Maybe parts of it were. But when I turn the story over in my hands now, what I feel isn't triumph, it's relief. I didn't set out to ruin a man. I set out to stop a woman myself from disappearing. I protected the years I gave the children I love, the self I almost traded away. If that looks like vengeance from the outside, perhaps it's because we don't yet have enough names for a woman who refuses to be erased. Tonight I'll cook for friends in my small, bright kitchen. The windows will fog and someone will tell a joke that makes us all lean into the table. After they leave, I will wash the wine glasses one by one and set them on the towel to dry. I will lock my door. I will turn out the lights. I will sleep. If this story found you at just the right moment, if you saw yourself in the quiet woman with the steady hand, take a breath with me. Share this with someone who needs proof that calm can be a battle cry. Leave a note so another woman doesn't feel alone at her own table. And if you want more stories like this true, messy human stay, pull up a chair. We're not done talking.